Good day, everyone, and welcome to another Live with Kevin, another eventual episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So glad that you're here with me today. If you're with us live, make sure you say hello. Tell us where you're from, whatever social channel you're on. Just use that comment section and tell us where you are. Well, we're glad to have you. And while you're here, I hope that you will imagine that you are joining my guest and I for a cup of coffee around a table. And if you were doing that, if you had a question, you'd ask it. If you had a comment, you'd share it. If you had an idea, you would share it. So I hope that you will do all of those things because it will make for a better conversation. It will eventually make for a better podcast, and it will certainly make this better for you in real time. So in all of those cases, I hope that you will do that, make yourself at home, settle in, and get ready for our conversation. So as I mentioned, if you didn't know, if this is your first time here, you can see up in the top corner here, over here, see that little thing that says Remarkable Leadership Podcast. This will eventually be on the podcast. So what I'm going to do now, excuse me, and you can learn more about that at remarkablepodcast.com. What I'm going to do now, though, is a countdown where the podcast itself will actually start. So all of this has just been for you live, or those of you who are watching it later. So here we go. Marissa, this is for you, the countdown for the podcast in 3, 2, 1. Questions. We ask them, but do we do it well enough, often enough, and for the right reasons? Those 3 questions should be reason enough for you to stay with us as we talk to who I think of as the king of questions, talking specifically about us as a leader and questions, as the title says, leading with questions. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively, make a bigger difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. Questions, certainly a part of that. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have been with us live, or I guess actually you could be with us for future live episodes. And to find out when they're taking place and how to get connected to those, you can join our LinkedIn or Facebook groups. And you can do that by going to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook. or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. That will get you in the know so that you can join us and get into these conversations sooner, get the value from them sooner. But as long as you're here on the podcast, today's episode is being brought to you by our latest book, The Long Distance Team, Designing a Team for Everyone's Success. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteambook.com, where you can get an excerpt, get all the links to order wherever you'd like to order it from, and learn more. longdistanceteambook.com. I hope you'll do that. And I hope you will virtually join me in welcoming our guest, Mr. Bob Tiede, who is joining us today. He has been on the staff of Cru, which was formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, for 52 years. First, 8 years as in the campus ministry, then for 24 years as the CEO of the Josh McDowell Ministry, and for the last 20 years on the U.S. leadership development team, developing the next generations of leaders for Cru. His blog, leadingwithquestions.com, is in its 11th year and is followed by leaders from over 200 countries. He's written 6 books, including Great Leaders Ask Questions, and Now That's a Great Question, and his newest book, and why he's here today, the 3rd edition of Leading with Questions, along with Michael Marquardt. And his mission is to help leaders everywhere multiply their leadership effectiveness 10 times by moving from let me tell you to let me ask you. Bob has been married for 53 years, is a dad of 4 adult married children, has 8 grandchildren. And Bob was with us once before. Back in March of 2017, he was the 41st episode of this podcast. And this is the 390th episode. Wow. So 6 years and 6 months and 350 episodes later, Bob, welcome. Glad to have you, my friend.
Kevin, delighted to be with you again.
We've also been together for Virtual LeaderCon. And if you, there we go. We got someone saying hello. Hello, Luciani. And Bob has also been with us for our Virtual LeaderCon event. You can learn more about that. It's upcoming at virtualleadercon.com. So, Bob, I did all that wonderful introduction of you. I called you the king of questions. And I mentioned this book, Leading with Questions. And I know that your sort of transformation as a leader from let me tell you to let me ask you started with the first edition of this book. And now you're the you're the co-author of this book. So tell us about that aha moment with this book, and how, and a little bit about the journey that leads you to now being the co-author of the third edition.
Oh, Kevin, delighted to share this story. In 2006, I found this book, literally this very book. It was a page turner. You can see I devoured it. And, my wife loves to go to bookstores. She goes all over the bookstore. When she's done, she knows she'll find me still in the leadership section. And my habit is to pull 2-3 books off that I've never seen before, peruse them to see if anyone's going home. Well, in 2006, I found this one, perused a few pages, said, this is going home. And Kevin, there's a morsel you get out of every book you read. But
or you better stop reading it.
Yeah. But I had no idea when I bought this book that it would change my leadership forever and actually set me even on a new path. And took it home. I was already on the leadership development team. I began to teach out of it. I put 8 sessions together, just straight out of the book. And fast forward to 2012, one of my colleagues said, Bob, you need to start a blog. So I started, I thought first, I don't want to do just another leadership blog. Wouldn't be anything wrong with that, but there were so many good ones. And so this question came to my mind. Was there a niche of leadership I could blog on? And as soon as I had that, it was like, well, it'd be something with this leading with question thing. So went to WordPress. First question they ask you is, what do you want your blog to be called? And on a lark, I type in leading with questions, smiling as I did, thinking surely the author, and I did not know Dr. Michael Marquardt or the publisher, Wiley, surely somebody has already tied this up. But no, it was available at, introductory price. I grabbed it. I got it legally. And I decided to blog for several months before I reached out to Dr. Marquardt. And I really didn't know, Kevin, how might he react? Right. Would he be happy or would he be like, you stole the name? And so waited a couple months, sent him a blog, shared how his book had changed my leadership forever, thanked him for writing it, shared about my blog, asked if I might post excerpts from the book with links to Amazon or wherever he'd like, hit send, wondering what the response would be. Within 24 hours, I had the most gracious response saying I'd made his day. Yes, Bob, you have absolute carte blanche permission to excerpt from the book. Thank you so much. Well, a couple of years later, his second edition came out. Now, prior to it coming out, he wrote me and said, Bob, would you do an endorsement? And could I include your blog as a recommended resource? Well, it was like,
Could I?
Of course. And so that happened. And then probably 6 months after the second edition came out, we were taking a group of our leaders to Washington, D.C., and he was a professor at George Washington University. I reached out in advance asking, Mike, are you going to be in town? Actually, it was still Dr. Marquardt. Will you be in town? Might you be willing to come speak? And yes. And hey, I'll buy copies of the book for everyone. Might you come an hour early and autograph them? And that was actually a selfish request because I wanted to spend an hour with him one-on-one.
It wasn't going to take an hour for him to sign the books, just saying.
Right. I opened the books and he signed them. And it was at that point I was saying, Dr. Marquardt, and he said, Bob, it's Mike. Just call me Mike. And so it's been Mike ever since. And we did some things together. And then about a year and a half ago, Mike calls and says, Bob, it's time for a third edition. And Bob, would you be willing to be the co-author? You willing? Mike, are you sure? He said, Bob, absolutely. He said, but in the interest of full disclosure, a new book needs about 25% new content. And he said, Bob, all that new content is on your blog with the over 1,000 blog posts you've done in the last, at that point, 10 years.
Yep.
And so last summer, we spent about 6 weeks working together. He's a brilliant man. He knew what he wanted to delete. I would feed him all sorts of options from the blog of possibilities to insert in each chapter. He would pick them. And April 25th, Leading with Questions, the third edition was released. So that's the story.
So I have the first edition, and I have the third edition. This one's signed by you. I didn't ever have edition number 2. I'm not even sure that I knew it existed until I knew that this one said third edition. But now I want to ask some questions. There's a lot of stuff that people ask you regularly, and I told you I'm going to go a slightly different direction. Obviously, we're not going to change topics. We're going to talk about questions, but I'm as I went through the book and as I was thinking about what I wanted to ask you. So first of all, everybody, always a challenge to think about asking good questions of someone who's so good at and cares so much about questions. But given that, I'm going to start here. What is it that keeps leaders from even asking questions, let alone asking good ones? Like there are many leaders that are still in, let me tell you. And so what keeps them from asking questions? What are some of the things?
Well, Kevin, I think the big thing, and I'm reflecting, this is confession of myself, is the thought that I'm a leader and leaders need to have all the answers. And so if I can't admit that I don't have an answer because I'm the leader, I don't want to look weak to my staff or anyone else. So I've got to project this image that I have all the answers. And I remember being that leader. Kevin, guess what I was tempted to do when I was asked a question and didn't have an answer?
Well, I know enough about you to think that this isn't probably it, but I'm going to guess what most people do, which is make it up.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't think that's you, but I think that's a lot of people.
Kevin, that was me. That was me. And my staff are gracious. No one ever stood up and said, Bob, I think you just made that up. But I'm sure there were times they thought to themselves, I don't think he knew. I think he just made that up.
Kind of dancing around it a little bit, right? I think that, I've had that conversation with hundreds of leaders. They feel this pressure. They're supposed to know. They're supposed to have all this. And yet I always ask them this question. So do you want a leader who's a know-it-all? And they're like, no. I said, so why are you putting pressure on yourself to be one?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, here's a counterintuitive kind of thing. The leader who projects that he has all the answers actually comes across as maybe unsure of themselves and defensive. Yeah. The leader who, when they're asked a question, who says, hey, Kevin, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. What do you think the answer might be? Actually comes across as having self-confidence. And
absolutely right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that when we as leaders give answers, we deny space to others to say anything, to add anything, because like once we start talking, it's over because of the positional differential, power differential. Like there's nothing left. Apparently, not only does Bob not want me to say anything, but it's not worth me saying anything because Bob already said it.
A few years ago, I was attending a conference where Liz Wiseman was going to be speaking.
Who has been on this podcast. She's fantastic.
Yeah. She was speaking on her book, Multipliers. And Kevin, walking in, I thought, this is going to be great. She's going to be speaking about leaders like me. And then she started talking about diminishers. And she said, when you bring a diminisher a problem, they solve it for you. And I thought, well, wait a minute. I love to solve problems for people, but I thought that was a multiplier trait. And she said, no, that's a diminisher trait. She said, when you bring a diminisher, an idea, they say, Kevin, good idea, but if you also added this, this, and this, it'd really be great. And again, I thought, I love adding horsepower to ideas, but I thought that was a multiplier trait. And she said, when you bring an idea to a diminisher leader, after a couple of times, you think to yourself, I'm never bringing Bob another idea. It's never good enough.
Not worth it.
Yeah. And it really, it flipped my paradigm because I wanted to be a multiplier leader, but here I was doing diminisher things, thinking they were being a multiplier.
Yeah. Unintended consequences, right? So, like many of you as leaders got promoted because you were good at solving problems and having answers. And that's not necessarily. We all know that the best team members aren't necessarily the best leaders. And there's one of those reasons that they're different. So the need for questions. I mean, you know, the blog is 11 years old, and I've known you for probably 2/3 of that time. And I would say that questions, as leaders, our ability to ask questions is more important now than ever. Would you agree? And if so, why?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And the reason why is none of us, there's not a single leader that knows it all. And, you know, sometimes when I'm speaking, I ask a silly question. I bring somebody up and say, I've got a silly question, but go with me. I'm going somewhere. I say, you're in a rowboat with your whole team. We'll make it you and 9 others. And there's oars for everyone. And you want to get that rowboat across the lake as quick as possible. How many of them would you like to have row with you? Well, of course, all of them. And I say, that's a silly question. But now imagine you're seated at your conference table, same team. There's an opportunity on the table. If you're a leader like I used to be, thinking your job is to figure out how to take advantage of the opportunity, and their job is then to do what you tell them, how many mental oars are in the water? Well, only one. But if you lean forward and you say, hey, gang, what do you all think we might do to take advantage of this opportunity? Now, how many oars are in the water?
Everyone, right?
Everyone. And I say, now, is it possible? Not a guarantee, but is it possible, or maybe probable would be the right word, that one of them might have an idea better than anything you were thinking?
Almost assuredly.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, in a world that's more complex than ever, that requires us to have more perspectives than ever. And now we've got 10 perspectives and not just one, right? So,
yeah.
So,
Kevin, there's another story that comes to mind. Kevin, you know this. I'm a South Dakota farm boy.
I do.
And this is a story about Governor Christie Nome, but it's not a political story. Let me just assure you and the audience.
I just saw her on TV the other day acting like she was a plumber. It was quite humorous. Well, telling people that they ought to come to South Dakota and be apprentices. I love it.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
Well, she's a farm girl and love her. But she wrote a book, Not My First Rodeo. And in that book, she shares the story that during a legislative session, they're about 3 weeks into the session, and she is frustrated with her staff. They meet every morning and they discuss what's going to be introduced into, you know, what new bills, and she wants them to debate them back and forth so she can get a perspective. And she walks back to her office with her chief of staff saying, she, you know, just making noise on the tile, and she's frustrated. And she says, why don't they talk? And what she's saying is she's just not hearing the discussion among the team. And the chief of staff says, Governor, maybe you ought to try being quiet. And she said, well, what do you mean? He said, you know, we share about a certain bill and you immediately share your opinion. And he said, no one wants to argue with the governor. And so she took his advice, and the next day, instead of popping right up with her thoughts, she waited for them to speak, and she said it worked. Well, Kevin, that doesn't just work for governors. You know, if you have an issue on the table and the boss immediately speaks, no one wants to argue with the boss.
Talk less and talk later, Bob, is what I tell leaders all the time. You got to talk less and talk later. So what makes for great questions?
Kevin, I think about good, better, and maybe not best, but what I call platinum questions. Okay. Now, you know, a good question gives you some information. And I'm thinking, for example, Kevin, you and I meet people, and you're probably smarter than me, but we from time to time say, hey, how's business? Well, what do we typically hear when we just ask the question, how's your business going?
Well, it's good, or it's fine, or it's crappy. That's
yeah.
basically what you hear, one of those three things.
So I say that's a good question, but would you like a better question?
Sure.
And Kevin, here, another confession. My son has a business, and I'm guilty of asking him, hey, how's business going? And getting the one-word answer. And then somewhere I read this better question. And the better question was, hey, how's business going now in comparison to a year ago?
Yeah.
And so the next time I was with my son, I asked that question. Kevin, I got a 5-minute response.
And you learned something.
Yes. Yes. And I heard a very similar story from a mother. She said every day when her daughter came home from school, she'd say, honey, how was school today? Well, Kevin, you and I both know what she got. One word.
Fine.
Fine, good, boring. And so one day she thought, okay, the problem isn't my daughter. The problem is I'm asking a lousy question. And so she thought about it, and her daughter came home. She said, honey, tell me about your day today. And she said, at first, I didn't know if she'd actually heard me because there was silence. But she said, my daughter began to speak, and I think she went on for 10 minutes telling me about everything.
This thing and that thing and the recess and the this and the that, right?
Exactly.
So one of the things that makes for better questions then is making them more open-ended, right?
Yes.
And then it has a lot to do with how we ask them, and we'll get to that in a minute. But let's ask the flip side of this question, Bob. So, like, how do we screw them up? Like, what other than what we've just sort of already said, was just asking, okay, it's a fine question. Like, how, especially as leaders, how do we screw up the question asking process?
Well, let me go with a couple of thoughts. Number one is we ask questions that put people into a corner. It's kind of like there isn't a great way to respond. You know, it's almost like
I'm thinking of one I don't really want to say on recording here, but it's like yeah.
You know, Kevin, is it true that you've quit?
When did you stop beating your dog?
Well, yeah, exactly. I'm forgetting his name, but a Navy captain, submarine captain, said, ask questions that let them say yes. So if you're checking on their project, instead of saying, hey, Kevin, you got that project done, instead you say, hey, Kevin, tell me about the progress you're making on that project.
Right.
And therefore you can report, hey, we've got this done and this done and this, and we expect to get the whole thing done by such and such. Well, it's a question that gives you the answer you were looking for, but asks it in a way that doesn't make them feel like, I'm going to come across as a failure.
And it builds the relationship. So, like, one of the great things about using questions, it doesn't just give us better answers. It doesn't just sort of allow people to engage and be empowered and accountable, but it also changes the dynamic of the relationship, which we really haven't talked about. So there's a section in the book, and obviously we can't go over the whole section in the next couple of minutes. We are talking with Bob Tiede, one of the authors of the 3rd edition of Leading with Questions, how leaders discover powerful answers by knowing how and what to ask. So there's art in that. So if I were to say, what's the art of questioning, what would be a couple things that crossed your mind?
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind, Kevin, is what do you do after you ask the question? And
the opposite of what the governor did,
right,
which is to stop.
You stop. When I was speaking, I said, how would you like to become a better listener in 8 seconds? And every hand goes up. And I said, well, what sport has an 8-second clock? I mean, we can think it's nothing, but the answer is bull riding. Well, to a bull rider, 8 seconds is an eternity. To us, we think it's nothing, but here's what research shows. When the average person asks a question, and we're totally unaware of this, it's unconscious, we only wait 2 or 3 seconds for an answer because you see that silence seems like an eternity. And so you can become a better listener by simply being aware of this, asking your question, count silently to yourself, 1001, 1002, 1003. So to me, part of the art of questioning is asking the question and then giving them time and relax. In other words, don't be like, I'm waiting for your answer. Just sit back, keep comfortable eye contact, relax, and wait for them to answer. the longer the silence, generally, the better the answer.
So two thoughts about that. One is that I like to say ask expectantly. In other words, I'm expecting that you will have an answer, and if I'm expecting you have an answer, I'm more likely to wait for it rather than roll my mental eyes as to why you haven't said something instantly. And the other thing is, and if people are watching this, they'll see what I'm going to do. But especially when I'm doing things virtually, which I do a lot, like what you and I are doing right now, is I will ask, and then I'll do this. So for all of you that are listening, you don't know what I was doing.
Yes.
I was lifting up my tea cup and taking a sip of tea. Now, in this moment, there isn't actually any in it, but most of the time there actually is. And the point is, it slows me down. I can't talk if there's tea in my mouth. I can't talk when it's up to my mouth. And the other thing is, it tells the others subconsciously, he's not going to talk because the teacups, and I do it slow. And that's one of the things. It's the equivalent of the counting to 5, counting to 8, whatever. It's the equivalent of that. And it's made all the difference for me.
Another thought on the art of questioning is asking the second question. And by that, I mean that you ask the first question and they give you an answer. Instead of just moving on, and again, this isn't to be an inquisition, but there's something they share and you say, wow, tell me more about, and you name something specific that they just shared in their answer.
Yeah.
And then sometimes in that answer, there's another specific. Again, this is not an inquisition.
No, and we don't want it to feel like one.
Right.
And the other thing, everybody as a leader, even if we don't mean for it to be, we run the risk that it will feel like one, right? Because as someone said to me once, as a leader, our whisper feels like a yell. It sounds like a yell for them. So we've got to be really careful about that. One of the things you mentioned in the section about the art of questions, you mentioned the idea of the learner judger mindset. Take just a second on that. We're going to have to, I'm watching the clock. We got to keep moving, but talk about that just for a sec.
Well, Kevin, in asking a question, Kevin, why did you make that decision? Well, feels like judger. But if I say, hey, Kevin, what caused you to make that decision? Now, Kevin, I can't quite explain it, but there's a big difference on why did you make that decision and what or how did you come to that decision feels.
Yeah, 100%. Like the why question is super powerful, but it runs the risk of us feeling like we're 5 when we're asked the why question.
You feel judged.
Yeah.
Whereas, hey, how'd you come to that decision? Positions
walk me through that.
Yeah.
Help me understand what led you to this, whatever. Any of those things will work way better, right? So we've been talking, Bob, for our entire conversation about what we can do as leaders to be better at asking questions, right? And you and I could talk about this for much longer, but I want to take a second and go to a different place. And that is like, there's how we can get better at this, but then there's how we as an organization can get better at it. You guys call it the question culture. And again, we don't have time to unpack this in a great detail, but what would be 1 or 2 things you would say that we could do as an individual leader at any level to start to create a question culture on our teams?
Well, one idea that comes to mind that I think is fairly easy and doable, and that is to do question storming. And for example, here's an opportunity. Rather than asking, what should we do? Say, today we're going to approach this opportunity with a question storm. And here's what we're going to do. Our goal is to get 50 questions on the whiteboard about what do we need to have answered in order to figure out what to do about this opportunity. And so you keep going. Generally, they'll stop at around 25 and you just keep pushing till you get 50. And then once you have the 50, okay, it's time to vote. And that is, you can go up and mark what are the 10 questions here you think are most significant for us to answer.
Yep.
And so you go up and you identify the 10 out of the 50. And then, depending on the team, hey, everyone needs to take 1 or 2 or 3, whatever the team is. If you have
Right.
10, everybody takes 1. Go do the research to come back with the answer. And it's one way to start creating a question culture. The other is, it's similar to that, and that is, what questions do we need to answer here? What questions come to mind about whatever the issues are? And so that you're asking the team to generate questions that need to be answered rather than generating immediately answers to solve the issue. Those are 2 thoughts. I'm sure there's more. Kevin, what would you suggest?
Oh, those are great examples. And I love that you gave us tangible examples. I appreciate that a lot. So I already know the answer to this question. And so I will tell you that up front. But before we go into the final piece of our conversation, and you actually said it earlier, but what is your favorite question, Bob?
My favorite question is actually 4 questions together. What do you think? Followed by what else, and what else? And people say, well, you can't ask somebody, what do you think? What else, what else, what else? And I said, not in that rapid fashion, but a conversation. I asked Kevin, hey, what do you think? It's about something. And Kevin gives me that first answer rather than just moving on. I say, wow, Kevin, this is good. What else? And what I've discovered is it's actually the 3rd and 4th question that actually gets to their gold nugget, their very best thought. And I realized once I understood this, that even when I had asked somebody, what do you think? When they paused, I always moved on. It's like, okay, I asked, I got their answer. And what I realized is I was like that proverbial gold miner that mined for gold all his life. Finally quit. Somebody comes along later and says he was within 6 inches of the gold vein.
Yeah.
Well, if you only ask, hey, what do you think, and move on, you're like
picking
that
up your
gold
pick
miner.
too soon. You're picking up your pick too soon. So my version of that here, before we do move on to the final section of our time together, is what didn't I ask? Is there something you wish I would have asked, Bob, that I didn't?
Oh, Kevin, that's always a great question. It's in any situation. Kevin, let's see. Oh, here's one idea. How can you get a free book?
Bob, how can you get a free copy of Leading with Questions? There's a great question. How can people get a free copy?
One of the things we've been doing, and now we have over 300, but book ambassadors. And a book ambassador agrees to have a picture taken with the book, put it on social media, leave a review on Amazon, just a number of things. But if somebody will commit to doing that, we'll send them a free autographed book.
How do they do that? How do they, if they're saying, oh my gosh, I want to do that, what do they need to do, Bob?
I think the easiest thing is to go to my blog, leadingwithquestions.com, leadingwithquestions.com. And on any post at the bottom, there's a place to leave a comment. Say, I want to be a book ambassador, and leave me actually your email, but also your mailing address. The only way I can put it in your hands is your mailing address. We're not creating a mailing list, but we'll use that to send you your book. So any post, even the post doesn't refer to it, just leave a comment saying, I want to be a book ambassador.
Leadingwithquestions.com, where you can read blog posts from the last 11 years about questions. I think I've got a couple of posts there along the way. And that's also where you can learn more about getting the book. But a couple other questions before we go. So, Bob, what do you do for fun?
Kevin, one of the things I love to do for fun is just spend time with my grandkids.
I had a feeling that's where you were going.
Yeah. And we have grandkids age 24 to 1 years old. And
well, that's a range.
That is a range. Absolutely. but they're all fun. And there's just something about grandkids. All the things people have said, I realize they're cliches, but if we'd known how great the grandkids were going to be, we would have had them first. and things like that.
So we've got someone who wants to be a book ambassador, and Luciano, now you know how to do that. So you can do that. I'm sure they could also, if they didn't want that information public, they could send you an email, like a LinkedIn note or something.
Yeah, just find me somewhere, send a message, and it'll all be the same. But thank you.
For those of you that are watching, you can see behind Bob that there are books everywhere. So one of the things that I know Bob and I have in common is that we're both readers. So what's something you're reading right now? You showed me earlier before we started. What are you reading right now?
Change Friendly Leadership by Dr. Roger Dean Duncan. And we've had, one excerpt on my blog already, and we're about to have another one. But Dr. Duncan, just a brilliant thinker, forward by Stephen Covey. And, when we think of change, it a lot of times doesn't feel friendly. We hear, but most of us don't like change. So how do you make change in an organization, but do it where you'd be known as change-friendly leadership? And of course, in here, this won't surprise you, Kevin, he asks some great questions and talks about questions. He also talks about the silence. In fact, that's the next excerpt that's coming up in about a month from the book, is the value of science in asking questions. The value of silence, not science, silence.
So, Bob, you've already told us, but one last chance. Where can people connect with you? Where do you want to point people? Obviously, they can go to leadingwithquestions.com. Where do you want to point people before we wrap up?
Please, I invite you all. If you're not already a subscriber, join leaders from 190 nations, I guess 200 nations now. It's right on the screen there, leadingwithquestions.com. Cursor to the bottom right, there's a place to enter your email and click subscribe. Subscribing is free, and into your inbox every Monday and Thursday will come turnkey ready questions.
And you will join me on that list. So now, everybody, one of my favorite questions, it's certainly my favorite question to ask you, not my guest, but you here. And it's 2 words. Now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this conversation? Hopefully, you'll decide you want to get a copy of the book, maybe be a book ambassador. But beyond that, what did you take from this that you will go apply? Maybe you learned something about being a little more quiet. Maybe you learned something about talking later. Maybe you learned something about platinum questions, or maybe there's something you want to apply about question storming. Those are just a few of the things that I took notes on. What matters, though, is what you take notes on, but more importantly, what you take action on as a result of being here. So, Bob, I was one of those people that got a copy of this book when it first came out, and I'm so glad that I did. I'm so glad we've had the chance to have this conversation. Always good to spend time with you, and thank you so much for being here.
Kevin, my pleasure. I enjoy the time with you.
And everybody, if you enjoyed this, you will enjoy every one of these episodes. I told you this is the 390th conversation I've had with an expert leader or leadership expert, Bob being both. Every week, another interview, another conversation on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll be back next week. Hope you'll join us. If you are already subscribed, make sure that you like, refer, you know what to do. Do all those things, and come back and join us next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.